Welcome to today's show, where leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher and I explore the potential for Olympic-driven growth in the lead-up to the 2032 Brisbane Olympic Games. As history has shown us, the Olympics can serve as a catalyst for urban development and long-lasting change, turning South East Queensland into a highly connected and a livable, even more livable region. However, with Australia grappling with an approximately 20-year infrastructure backlog, the challenge of balancing this new development with the needs of a growing population is a real challenge that's going to be ahead. So in today's show, we delve into the importance of timely infrastructure development, learning from the success of Olympic host cities like Barcelona and Munich, and learning from those that didn't finish off as successful. And we're also going to explore the ambitious vision for South East Queensland as a thriving, interconnected megacity. And I guess we're going to discuss the challenges South East Queensland's facing in becoming this dynamic, evolving region. Now, if you live in Queensland, this information is going to be vital for you. And of course, as a property investor, it's going to be important to understand these things, even if you don't live in Queensland, but you may have an interest in investing in Brisbane, Australia's new world city. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
No place in Australia faces a brighter future than South East Queensland. It's got the potential of much-needed infrastructure construction coming up due to the Olympic Games. This catalyst event can bring infrastructure spending that would have probably happened in the future forward into the present now. And if it's done right, it can create great opportunities for growth and development. However, it's crucial that the region seizes this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity without squandering it. Well, that's the words of my guest today, leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher, co-founder of the Demographics Group. Now, Simon shares his thoughts on socio-demographic trends in the media, with Australian governments, with institutions and companies, and I'm really pleased that he's a regular guest on this podcast. Hi, Simon.
That's good to be back on.
Now, Simon, in a recent column of yours in The Australian, now I each week look at your column in the New Daily on a Sunday, and that's not behind a paywall, so I'd highly recommend people look at that. And then you regularly also write for the audience of The Australian, which is behind a paywall, but I subscribe to it. But you gave your thoughts as to why South East Queensland mustn't squander this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Tell us more.
Well, there's no region in Australia that I'm more optimistic about than South East Queensland. All the general factors that you might think about, beautiful weather, there is still space to develop, this is a market that is accustomed to apartments, all those things point to a lot of wonderful growth opportunities, but it is really the only region in Australia that at least stands a fighting chance to get all the infrastructure needs that are actually required to make it a thriving region. And the reason for that is, of course, the Olympic Games. This is the X factor that brings potentially infrastructure spending from the future into the present. And in the infrastructure world, we always say, if it ever needs to be built, it needs to be built now. So you want to build it early on, as soon as possible, in order to make infrastructure affordable and to help more people throughout its lifespan. We've seen negative examples of this in the west of Melbourne, for example, where we grew the population at a very fast rate, but we didn't grow infrastructure at the same pace. So all of a sudden, your Meltons, your Tanits weren't that well connected. And then you need to play infrastructure catch-up, which is outrageously expensive because you build into an existent urban structure. You can't just build on a greenfield site, which is relatively cheap, relatively quick. That's a problem. And if you have a backlog of infrastructure, you will always have a backlog of infrastructure. You can't just say, we're now building into the growth corridor of the north or the east of Melbourne, because if you were to build infrastructure there rather than in the west, the voters of the west would kill you in the booths. And there are no voters in the north or east just yet because they don't exist. So most regions are locked into this constant playing catch up and therefore developing artificially expensive infrastructure. Along comes South East Queensland, and they're the only region that could actually get this infrastructure. But all the infrastructure is linked to the condition of the games, meaning the infrastructure needs to be ready for the games. We don't care about those couple of weeks of athletic excellence. That's nice. It's wonderful. It'll be great for the brand of Queensland, of Brisbane in particular. But ultimately, who cares?
Well, when you look at property markets over the last years related to the Sydney Olympics or the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne or Queensland, it really didn't do much to them. It really is that the locals did well because there was infrastructure building. But you're suggesting, or you did in your article in The Australian, that we're about 20 years behind. There's a 20-year backlog. Is that true?
Well, it's a rough estimate. We were saying, well, how much infrastructure backlog do we have? How long would it take to build all the stuff that we ideally would have? And that's an impossible question to answer, but I'd say right around 20 years is probably correct to make a Melbourne, a Sydney function at its absolute ideal. You probably need to develop right around 20 years worth of infrastructure. And it's not important just how much, what exactly this figure is. It just is important to understand that it's a long time that we need to develop this infrastructure. But in Southeast Queensland, if we focus our infrastructure spending not so much on building a GABA that costs $2+ billion to renovate, because that's not providing all that massive benefit for the whole population, what we want to focus our infrastructure spending on is to improve the connectivity between the hubs of Southeast Queensland, meaning the Sunshine Coast, Brisbane, and Gold Coast and Brisbane, and even down to Toowoomba. If you connect the city, if you connect these 4 hubs, you have the best connected conurbation urban settlement in Australia. Because all of a sudden, if you think of Southeast Queensland as a single geographic unit, they're much better connected than Melbourne or Sydney, because you have 3 international airports, you have a regional airport, you could have wonderfully connected, independently operating hubs. So it can be, at least theoretically, an absolute gem of a city.
Well, I think we should try and learn from what's happened overseas, from the mistakes as well as the successes. And there have been some successes with countries like, or cities like Barcelona and Munich that leveraged the games. It improved their region, and it leaves a long-lasting effect. So it's not only the short-term boost on the economy, but isn't it nice when it keeps that long-lasting effect for future generations?
Absolutely. And I think this positive narrative about the Olympics is not mentioned enough, because usually people just remember the failures of a Athens, of a Beijing Games, where they just built future ruins. And that's not what we must aim for. If an Olympics is done right, Barcelona and Munich are the best examples, and you can permanently improve the lot of a city. I'm from Munich, and Munich, of course, was a bombed out city after the end of the Second World War. And when they got the okay to rebuild the city in line with the Olympic bid in the 1960s for the 72 games, they wanted to rebuild this small metro system just underneath the inner core of Munich. And the mayor, a bit of a sly fox, realized if he was to build this train line really out into the Bavarian hinterlands, left, right, and center, he would get additional federal funding. So he didn't do this because, he figured he had a big grand plan. He just figured he can snatch up more federal money for his neck of the woods. And he did so. And they built the train lines out to small little settlements, not significant towns. But over the last 60 years, since the first tracks got laid down, this is the skeleton upon which the urban infrastructure, or just the whole population of Lower Bavaria, developed. This, if it's done right, the build it and they will come approach to infrastructure will shape a region for decades to come at a relatively small cost. It was, of course, a big chunk of money at the time, but in the long run, it's a bargain. Barcelona and their train system, their redevelopment of certain areas, additional new affordable housing stock, completely changed that city as well. We can use the games, but we risk at the moment that we're not making the most of those opportunities. And that is breaking my heart.
Well, there are also the soft infrastructure things we should be talking about as well. But interestingly, the Queensland government's budgeted $37.6 billion with a B dollars of infrastructure spending over the next 4 years alone. There's the Crossrail, River Rail. There's the Gabba redevelopment, Brisbane Live, which is a great $2.5 billion investment. Queen's Wharf, which is almost completed now anyway. They're building a metro finally. And there's the new Queensland Cancer Centre. We're building a metro here in Melbourne, and they're doing it in Sydney as well. It's interesting. The point you made a moment ago is it's so much more expensive to retrofit these things, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Just think of a simple thing like a tunnel. Digging a tunnel under an existing city is super dangerous, super expensive, and it's slow. If you build a tunnel within a greenfield site, you just dig a bit of a trench and put a tube in, and that's it. That is dirt cheap compared to building a city underneath.
That's not a pun.
That's right. And so ideally, if you plan a city not 10 years ahead. You plan a city 50, 60 years ahead. And we must come to accept in Australia that a city like Melbourne will grow at well over 100,000 people per year, every year, until we possibly can't squeeze anyone into the city anymore. And you can like this, you can dislike this, but if you are being realistic about the future of a city, you want to say, well, what kind of infrastructure would be needed to make Melbourne a better place at 6, at 7, at 8, at 9 million people, and then build it. It requires long-term thinking, and it requires uncomfortable conversations.
Well, it also requires politicians who are prepared to invest in areas where there aren't many constituents, many voters voting for them yet. Most politicians are really interested in getting in again in 3 or 4 years' time, so that makes it hard. So we've talked about, I guess, about what I'd like to call maybe the hard infrastructure, but if you've got 100,000 people coming in, that means more children, more schools, more aged care, more hospital. How are we coping with that around Australia?
Well, if you look at the population forecasts in the immediate 10 years or so, we're not overall growing the number of kids. We'll roughly stagnate with the number of kids. We'll have as many kids 0 to 14 in 10 years' time than we have now, more or less. So we don't need all that many more schools, but we need them elsewhere because the settlement patterns are changing. All of a sudden, you have the young millennial families not living in the middle suburbs, but in the outer suburbs. So schools need to be built elsewhere because the customers are elsewhere. And that means you have some schools that will need to be closed. So there's lots and lots of these bit of softer infrastructures that will need to be repurposed. So there's always need for redevelopment. There's always need for funding mechanisms to pull off these stunts, and smart and really creative ideas how to revamp an old building like a school into something that can be of use without too much cost associated.
I guess the other infrastructure is we're going to need more aged care as we're aging.
That's one of my favorite topics to be talking about, is the rapid aging of the population. We're going to double the population aged 85 plus in Australia over the next 12 years. That number 85 is significant because half of us will have died before 85, and the other half that is still alive will yet again be split in two halves. One half requires assistance with activities of daily life. They need care. We don't have the pipeline for aged care workers. We have the desire of the current cohort that is currently still in their 70s. They are young, healthy, active. Of course, all the joints hurt a bit more.
You're looking at me?
barely made it in this group.
I just made it, just squeezed in at the end of last year, yeah.
And so at 70, you're still absolutely fine. In 10 years' time, things will hurt more and more. And in 15 years' time, there's a high likelihood that you require care. It's a very uncomfortable conversation to have with your parents, with yourself, and even on a population level, because we know that the cohort that is now going to age is very independently minded. The baby boomers, they want to continue to live independently in their home. So we'll need to retrofit homes. We need to make sure that these homes are accessible. We need to probably invent heaps more service offerings that enables people to live independently for longer. And that's a big challenge. And currently, we're not prepared for it. So we're slowly thinking about this. There are a couple of government agencies that are trying to build a pipeline for aged care workers. But really, with the existing population in Australia, we have not even a fighting chance to get this right. So this will need a high immigration approach. I am very happy for people to advocate a low immigration approach, a small Australia approach, as long as they can provide answers regarding how we cope with the aging of the population. It is very, very labor intensive to grow old as a nation. And currently, we just don't have enough care workers to look after the future elderly population of Australia. So that's one reason why we need infrastructure upgrades, why we need to revamp our cities to make sure that they are livable for our elderly for longer, so that they can remain independent and healthier for a longer period of time.
Well, I always love these chats because we started off talking about the Olympics and infrastructure and ended up with old people and aged care homes. But that doesn't matter because I like to tap into your thinking and your research on what's ahead for the future. I think that's important for owners, business owners, for property investors, for professionals to understand what's ahead, because we really do live in the best country in the world and at a great time. So let's hope our governments, our regulators don't squander these opportunities. Look forward to catching up with you again soon, Simon.
It's been a pleasure once again.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Simon Kuestenmacher, and if you did and it gave you some insights into our future, your future, why not subscribe to this podcast? Just click the little follow button on whichever podcast app you're listening to this so you can be kept up to date. And in a moment, I'm going to share with you my mindset moment to help you think differently and give you a different result. But before we do, I'd like to just ask you a question. Are you facing some property challenges at the moment? Because you're almost certainly listening to this podcast because you're interested in property. All the negative messages in the media making you feel anxious and uncertain. Maybe you're not sure whether you should buy, whether you should sell, whether you should do anything at all. Now, clearly you're in good company because at Metropole we're seeing a lot of people with concerns. They're worried about making a mistake, buying too early or buying in the wrong location. The banks are giving them a hard time. Others are wondering, should they buy first home or should they invest first? And I know a lot are wondering about, should they be selling an underperforming investment property? Whatever your property question, why not turn to the proven and trusted team at Metropole and take advantage of our experience to give you sound, unbiased advice in the current markets? Now, we don't sell property. We're Australia's largest buyer's agent and we'd love to help you buy property, but buying a property doesn't suit everybody. And that's why we always start off by building you a strategic property plan. Now, currently, we're seeing many strategic investors take a long-term focus in getting ready to move into the market, but I don't know your personal circumstances. So why not have a chat with my team and organise a complimentary clarity consultation? Now, interestingly, you've probably heard me say that it's too early to call the market bottom yet, but we're getting there. So whether you're just getting started or wanting to grow your existing portfolio, go to metropole.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show note and have a chat with my team. We're going to offer you a time-tested system, over 50 years of market perspective, over $5 billion worth of property transactions, and true on-the-ground team in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And as I said, we don't sell property, so our advice is independent and unbiased. And of course, you're going to have access to Metropole Wealth Advisory with Ken Race, our property renovations, development, property management, finance strategists as well. Metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with some very successful business people, property investors and entrepreneurs. And I've also met some, I guess, not so successful people. And I found that in general, people fall into one of two groups. Those who make excuses and those who don't. Now, the ones who make excuses, they don't start that way. I mean, no one's born talented at making excuses, but over the years, they learn to get out of things. They learn how to blame the economy, their parents, the teachers, the system, pretty much anything they can deflect the blame on. These give them the excuses they need. And of course, there's the other group of people, those who don't make excuses, or rather won't. Now, we all have our difficulties, and some days we feel like making excuses. But winners stop themselves. They don't make excuses. They just get the job done. Interestingly, we all have similar capabilities. Yes, we've got similar capabilities to get things done or not, and to make excuses about it. And when you wake up in the morning, you get to choose which route you take. Now, I recently read an insightful quote that said the difference between successful people and unsuccessful people is that smart people hate doing the same thing that unsuccessful people hate doing. But successful people do it anyway. So as you go on this journey we call life, you're going to get a chance to back out and make excuses or not. You have the choice. You decide. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?